I was cutting the turkey in my own dining room when my grandson Liam, only 11 years old, shouted at the top of his lungs, "Grandma smells like rotten fish." The table froze for a second and then erupted. My daughter's husband Greg burst into laughter, clapping as if it were a comedy show. My granddaughter Emily nearly choked on mashed potatoes from laughing so hard, and I just placed my fork down, my hand trembling, and felt the air leave my chest. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 68, a retired community librarian in Cleveland, Ohio. I raised 2 children, Monica and Daniel, after my husband Robert died in a fishing accident on Lake Erie nearly 30 years ago. I worked double shifts to make sure Monica had private lessons and Daniel could go to college. Now, Monica lives here with Todd, Caleb, and Sophie in the very house Robert and I saved our entire lives to buy. Thanksgiving used to be a sacred day of gratitude. But in recent years, it had turned into a stage for mockery. Monica often sighed impatiently at me, whispering to Todd about old people's smells. He only smirked, letting the kids repeat her words. Respect, once my family's foundation, had crumbled into casual cruelty. The words rotten fish cut deeper than they understood. Robert's hands always smelled of nets and brine. It was the scent of our youth, of survival. For my grandson to twist that into an insult felt like desecration. I stayed silent, while the laughter roared around me. My joints ached as I gripped my glass, trying not to spill. Every face I looked at, Monica's dismissive, Todd's mocking, Caleb and Sophie's cruel amusement, was a reminder of everything I had given and how little remained of their gratitude. That night, after the house grew quiet, I washed dishes alone. Water ran over my hands as I whispered prayers under my breath. Lord, did I sacrifice too much? Did I raise them wrong? The tears fell into the sink, but what hardened inside me wasn't sorrow, it was resolve. The next morning, I gathered them all back at the table. My voice was calm, almost unnervingly steady. I looked at Caleb first. You thought it was funny to call me rotten fish. But this home, this meal, this life you only have because of me. His eyes dropped to the table. Then I turned to Monica and Todd. I am not your burden. I am not your punchline. From today, respect is the rent you pay to stay under my roof. If you cannot give it, you will leave forever. Todd opened his mouth to sneer, but I cut him off. I've transferred this house into a trust. Daniel is co-executor. Any violation of this rule, and you will be gone by sundown. Don't test me. Silence filled the room. Sophie bit her lip. Caleb whispered, "I'm sorry, Grandma." Monica's eyes watered, caught between shame and fear. Todd clenched his jaw, but said nothing. I felt taller, stronger than I had in years. Not a victim, not a burden, but Evelyn Harper, who built this family on her back and would not let them destroy her dignity. As I cleared the table, I whispered one last time, not in despair, but with certainty, "Lord, thank you. Respect has returned to this house." I sat frozen at the table after Caleb's words, hearing the echo of his laughter tangled with Todd's clapping. For a moment, my fork hovered midair, my appetite completely gone. Monica glanced at me, but quickly lowered her eyes, as though she feared siding with me would upset her husband. Sophie covered her mouth, choking on laughter, and I realized I was the only one in that room carrying the weight of shame. To them, it was only amusement. I felt my throat tighten, but I swallowed back every word I wanted to scream. Silence was safer, at least for now. I had lived long enough to know that anger, when shown too early, becomes weakness. Instead, I carved their faces into my memory. Caleb's smirk, Todd's smug grin, Sophie's cruel giggle, Monica's quiet betrayal. They thought they had humiliated me, but all they had done was light a fire I no longer wished to extinguish. When dinner ended, I collected the plates while they carried on with careless chatter, as if nothing had happened. The clatter of porcelain in the sink masked my trembling. I remembered the years when Monica was a little girl, when I worked 2 jobs to pay for her private lessons. I thought of Robert's calloused hands after days at the docks, and how we saved for decades to own this house. The walls themselves seemed to whisper that my sacrifices were being mocked. The photographs lining the hallway stopped me in my tracks that night. Robert, smiling proudly beside his boat. Daniel, holding his law diploma. Monica as a child, clutching the red sweater I'd sacrificed overtime hours to buy. Each frame once filled me with pride, but now they felt like mirrors reflecting my failure. I had taught them generosity without teaching them gratitude. I had mistaken unconditional love for permission to be disrespected. That realization hardened into something sharp and unyielding inside me. When the first light of morning touched the curtains, I understood what I had to do. No apology, no hollow words of regret would ever erase the venom of their laughter. If they could mock me so openly in my own home, then they had forgotten whose name still stood on the deed. Respect was no longer negotiable. I would not beg, I would not plead. From now on, I would set rules and enforce them without hesitation. If you have ever had your dignity turned into entertainment for others, you know the strength that begins to awaken when patience runs dry. This is only the beginning of what I chose to do, and the storm that followed will show them the true cost of betrayal. Do not leave now, stay with me until the end, because the decision I made next is what changed everything forever. The morning after that Thanksgiving humiliation, I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the faded quilt Robert and I had bought decades ago. My body ached with age, but it was not weakness that kept me still, it was calculation. I had reached the point where silence was no longer protection but surrender. If they could laugh at me openly, then it was time I reminded them of who truly owned the ground beneath their feet. I entered the kitchen where Monica was making coffee. She glanced at me, clearly avoiding eye contact. I asked her why she had stayed quiet when her son mocked me so cruelly. She muttered that Caleb was only a child and didn't understand the weight of his words. I looked her in the eye and said, "A child learns from the adults who cheer for his cruelty. Silence is not innocence, Monica, it is agreement." Todd walked in shortly after, smug as always. He reached for a mug and smirked as he said, "I hope you don't still smell like last night's joke." My hands tightened on the edge of the counter, but I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I told him calmly, "You've mistaken my patience for weakness. This is my house, Todd, not yours." The laughter ended last night. Today, the rules begin. He chuckled dismissively, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. That same day, I made a phone call to Daniel. He was my son, the one who had built a career as an attorney, far from this house. I told him what had happened, every detail. There was silence on the other end, before he said, "Mom, this is unacceptable. You need to set boundaries, and if they don't respect them, you have every right to send them out." His words didn't just comfort me, they armed me. I finally had the clarity to act. By evening, I had gathered Monica, Todd, Caleb, and Sophie in the living room. I stood in front of the fireplace where Robert's old photographs still hung. I said, "From this day forward, respect is not optional here. If you laugh at me, belittle me, or forget what I sacrificed for you, then you will no longer live under my roof. This is not a threat. It is a law, and it begins now." The room fell silent, but I felt power return to me. Strength is not always loud, and revenge is not always violent. Sometimes it is the simple act of drawing a line and refusing to let anyone cross it. I had drawn mine, and the days ahead would test whether they believed me or not. What happened next would decide the fate of everyone in this house. If you want to see how a family unravels when truth is spoken without fear, make sure to subscribe, because the storm is only beginning. The silence that followed my declaration was not the silence of respect, but of calculation. Todd leaned back on the sofa with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. Monica twisted her fingers nervously, caught between loyalty to her husband and the truth she knew she could no longer ignore. Caleb fidgeted, his smirk gone, while Sophie kept her gaze fixed on the floor. I could almost hear the gears turning in their minds as they weighed how far I would go. Todd broke the silence first, his voice sharp. "So you're threatening to throw your own family onto the street? That's rich, Evelyn." I met his stare without blinking. "This is not a threat," I said evenly. "It's a promise." He scoffed, but I noticed the way his jaw tightened. For the first time, he understood that the woman he dismissed as weak was the same woman who built this house with her own sacrifices. Later that evening, Monica came to me alone in the kitchen. Her voice was hesitant as she said, "Mom, you don't really mean to send us away, do you? We have nowhere else to go." I looked at her and replied, "You had somewhere to go when you laughed at me in my own home. You chose comfort over respect. If you want to stay, you will teach your children the value of dignity, because I will not raise them again." Caleb and Sophie avoided me for days after that confrontation. Their laughter was gone, replaced with nervous glances each time I entered the room. Todd tried to maintain his arrogance, but I could see the cracks forming. He stayed out longer, coming home with the smell of alcohol clinging to him. Monica busied herself with chores she had never touched before, perhaps realizing that comfort could no longer be taken for granted. Slowly, the balance in the house was shifting. I spent those nights lying awake, planning every step. The deed was safe, the trust untouchable. Daniel's voice echoed in my memory, reminding me that the law was on my side. I had once thought justice was too heavy a burden for my shoulders, but now it felt like armor. They had mistaken my silence for surrender, and soon they would discover what it meant to live under rules written in steel, rather than forgiveness. Family ties are fragile when they are built on convenience instead of love. What I chose to do next was not out of cruelty, but out of survival. My home would not become a stage for ridicule again. Tell me, If you were in my place, would you forgive such humiliation, or would you finally set fire to the illusions of loyalty? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know how far you would go to defend your dignity. Todd's defiance did not last long before reality struck. One afternoon, I found him rifling through drawers in the living room, pretending to look for misplaced documents. His expression shifted when he realized I was watching. I asked him calmly what he was searching for. He muttered, "Nothing important," but I knew. He was looking for proof that the house still belonged solely to me, desperate to undermine the trust I had placed in Daniel's hands. When Monica confronted me later that day, her tone was sharper than usual. She said, "Todd is worried you'll follow through with your threat. What do you expect us to do, Mom? Live in fear of being thrown out?" I looked at her directly. Respect is not fear, Monica. It is acknowledgement. You should have thought about that before encouraging your children to laugh at me. Her eyes filled with tears, but I felt no urge to comfort her this time. The days that followed revealed the cracks widening in their facade. Caleb grew quiet, watching me from across the table, but avoiding any careless words. Sophie stopped mocking me, though the resentment in her face remained visible. Todd, however, grew more irritable, stomping through the house like a man robbed of his crown. For the first time, I felt the weight shifting in my favor. Their silence was not peace, but submission born of desperation. I decided to take my next step with precision. I contacted Daniel again, explaining that Todd was attempting to search for loopholes. Daniel reassured me that the trust was airtight, and that no move could strip me of control. He told me, "Stand firm, Mom. If they cross your line again, you have every legal right to remove them immediately." His confidence became the foundation of my resolve. They no longer held power over me, I held it over them. That evening, I gathered the family once more. My voice carried no anger, only certainty. I said, "You are still here because I am giving you the chance to change, but hear me clearly. The next insult, the next act of disrespect, and you will pack your bags." Todd tried to laugh, but his voice cracked when he said, "You wouldn't dare." I replied, "Watch me." And for the first time, fear flickered across his face. Control is never given freely. It is claimed and defended. I had allowed them to believe I was powerless, but that illusion was gone. Every move they made now was in reaction to my presence, not the other way around. And yet, I knew the storm was not finished. It was only gathering. If you believe strength should never be underestimated, share this story forward. Because what came next proved just how fragile arrogance truly is. The breaking point came on a cold Friday evening. I had just returned from the grocery store when I heard raised voices coming from the living room. Todd was on the phone, pacing back and forth, his tone sharp and mocking. He said loudly, "I can't wait for the old woman to finally croak, so we can take what's ours." He knew I was within earshot. The words were not careless, they were meant to wound. I stepped into the room, setting my bags down with deliberate calm. Todd met my eyes, unflinching, daring me to react. I asked him, "Did you really just say that about me in my own home?" He smirked and replied, "If the shoe fits, Evelyn." I felt the fury rise in my chest, but I kept my voice even. "Then pack your bags, Todd. Tonight is the night you learn what consequences taste like." Monica rushed in from the kitchen, panic etched across her face. "Mom, please, he didn't mean it," she pleaded. "He's just frustrated. You know how he gets." I turned to her with steady eyes. "A frustrated man reveals his truth, Monica. If he believes this house is his to inherit, then he's forgotten who gave him shelter." Todd laughed bitterly, but his laughter cracked when I said, "The trust is sealed, Monica. You can beg, but the decision is already made." The children watched from the staircase, wide-eyed. Caleb whispered to Sophie, "Are we really leaving?" The fear in his voice was a bitter reminder of the chaos their parents had sown. I looked up at them and said, "Respect is not learned in laughter, it is learned in consequence. Tonight, you will learn that lesson." Todd shouted that I was cruel, that no decent mother would throw out her family. I replied calmly, "A decent family would never treat me this way." I called Daniel immediately, putting the phone on speaker. He listened quietly as I explained what Todd had said. Then his voice, firm and authoritative, filled the room. "Legally, she has every right to remove you, Todd. You crossed the line. Consider this your final night here." Todd's face drained of color. Monica covered her mouth, realizing the fight was over before it began. Caleb and Sophie stayed frozen, unable to process the reality that their arrogance had finally reached its end. That night, I felt the weight of decades lifting from my shoulders. My decision had not been easy, but it had been just. Todd would leave, and with him, the poisonous mockery that had corrupted my home. Monica had a choice to make: follow him into the cold, or finally remember who had built the ground beneath her feet. "Tell me, If you stood where I stood, would you choose mercy or justice? Share your answer. I want to know where your heart lies. Todd left that night with nothing but a duffel bag and a trail of curses. His footsteps echoed on the porch as the door slammed shut behind him. The house was suddenly quiet, but not peaceful. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of choices yet to be made. Monica sat at the dining table, her face pale, staring at the wood grain as if the answers to her life were etched there. I stood in front of her, steady, unyielding. Monica, I said, you have lived here for years without paying rent, without contributing to the roof over your head. I gave you security, and in return, you let your children mock me and your husband poison my home. She looked up with tears in her eyes. Mom, I was afraid of losing him. I whispered back, and in protecting him, you lost me. The children were restless that night. Caleb crept into the kitchen, his voice low. Grandma, is he coming back? I shook my head and answered. Actions have consequences, Caleb. Your father chose his. Sophie appeared behind him, her tone sharper. You're breaking our family apart. I looked at her and said, no, Sophie, your father did that with his contempt. What I am doing is repairing the damage he left behind. Their silence told me the truth was beginning to settle in. Over the next few days, Monica tried to fill Todd's absence with chores she had ignored for years. She cleaned, cooked, and even joined me in the garden, though her hands were clumsy and uncertain. I could see her desperation to prove she could remain here without him, but I did not bend easily. Respect had to be earned, not pleaded for. Every small effort she made was weighed against years of silence that had enabled cruelty. Daniel called again, his voice calm but firm. Mom, you have every right to keep her accountable. If Monica wants to stay, she has to respect the rules. Do not weaken now. I assured him that I had no intention of softening. Monica listened from the doorway, her face caught between shame and hope. She finally said, I will do whatever it takes, Mom. Please let me stay. I replied, prove it, Monica. Words mean nothing without change. Life is full of turning points, and this was hers. Whether she would rise or collapse depended on what she did next. For me, there was no turning back. The line had been drawn in stone, and I would not erase it for anyone. If you were in my place, would you allow her a second chance, or close the door forever? Leave a like if you believe. Second chances must be earned, not given freely. Monica's attempts to redeem herself began slowly, almost timidly. She cooked breakfast for the children, scrubbed the floors, and even washed the curtains that had been untouched for years. But no amount of soap could wash away the years she allowed Todd's cruelty to spread through this house. I watched her carefully, noting every effort, every failure. She wanted to prove she belonged, but the weight of her silence in my darkest moments still lingered like a shadow over us both. One evening, as the children sat quietly in their rooms, Monica approached me in the kitchen. She placed a steaming cup of tea in front of me, her voice trembling as she said, Mom, I don't want to lose you. I replied, you already lost me the night you chose his pride over my dignity. She shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. I will change, she whispered. I told her, then prove it with actions, not words. Caleb tried to bridge the silence that had grown in the house. He began helping in small ways, carrying groceries and tidying the living room. One afternoon he said softly, Grandma, I'm sorry for what I said at Thanksgiving. His apology was clumsy, but it was more than Monica had offered until now. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, respect is not a game, Caleb. I accept your words, but I expect your actions to match them every day. Sophie, however, clung to resentment. She rolled her eyes when asked to help and muttered under her breath whenever I gave instructions. One night I overheard her telling Caleb that I was ruining everything, that life was better when Dad was in charge. Her words stung, not because they surprised me, but because they proved the poison Todd had planted still festered. I knew Sophie's change, if it ever came, would be the hardest to earn. Monica grew more desperate as days passed. She woke before dawn to start chores, tried to share stories at dinner, and forced smiles in moments where silence felt safer. But her efforts always carried the scent of desperation rather than genuine remorse. I confronted her one evening saying, Monica, you cannot repair years of betrayal with chores. Respect is not measured in clean floors. It is measured in how you stand beside me when others try to tear me down. She nodded, broken by the truth. The air in the house remained heavy, but I felt something shifting within me. I was no longer the woman who swallowed humiliation in silence. I was the one setting the terms of survival under this roof, and they knew it. Every look, every word, every step they took was measured against the boundary I had drawn, and soon they would face the final decision. If you believe dignity is worth more than blood ties, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. The final decision came one quiet Sunday morning. Sunlight spilled across the dining table, but there was no laughter, no warmth. Monica sat across from me, her hands folded tightly, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. Caleb stared at his plate, silent and subdued. Sophie glared, defiant as always, unwilling to bend. I knew this was the moment to end the cycle. I would no longer allow hesitation to hold my tongue or my hand. I cleared my throat and spoke with a voice sharper than the knife I used to carve roasts for them. I said, "This house was built with sacrifice, and it will not be poisoned any longer. Monica, you must decide now whether you will walk beside me or leave with Todd." She whispered, "Mom, please, give me time." I shook my head. "Time has been wasted. You choose today, or you lose forever." Her tears streamed freely as she confessed, "I cannot follow him. I need to stay." For the first time, her words sounded less like excuses and more like truth. But I didn't yield easily. "Then you will prove yourself every day," I replied. "No more silence, no more weakness. If you hear cruelty in this house and stay quiet, you will pack your bags. Respect will be the only currency here." Monica nodded, trembling, knowing the rules were no longer negotiable. Sophie exploded, her voice filled with anger. "This isn't fair, Grandma. You're tearing us apart." I turned to her and said, "No, Sophie, your father tore us apart. What I am doing is putting the pieces back together with steel instead of paper." She crossed her arms and muttered, "I'll never forgive you." I looked her in the eye and replied, "Forgiveness is not my goal. Respect is, and one day, you will understand the difference." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, his young voice breaking, as he said, "I don't want to leave, Grandma. I want to stay with you." His words, simple and unpolished, carried more weight than all of Monica's pleas. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "Then learn, Caleb. Learn that love without respect is worthless. Learn that dignity is not a game. If you do, you will grow stronger than your father ever was." His nod was small, but it was real. As I rose from the table, I felt no regret. The woman who once wept in silence had been buried, and in her place stood someone unshakable. They would live under my roof by my terms or not at all. Justice had finally found its home here, and it would not leave with anyone. If this story struck you, leave a comment telling me what dignity means to you, because for me, it is worth more than blood itself.